it says it's recording, so let's hope for the best here. Okay. So the infrastructure of consciousness is the topic, and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. So I make a sharp distinction. Can everybody see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So I make a sharp distinction between being conscious and the contents of consciousness. By contents of consciousness, I mean what you're conscious of when you're conscious. Some people don't make this distinction, and I find it confusing because they'll say that something is a neural correlate of consciousness and, like vision in the primary visual cortex or something. And it's not clear to me what they mean by that. To me, being conscious is either you're conscious or you're not. And on the left is a picture of what an anesthesiologist might look at. One of their screen was monitoring your brain activity. So here this person's being operated on and he's unconscious. He's not conscious of anything. But as you can see, there's plenty of brain activity going on. So brain activity and consciousness are not, obviously the same thing. Anesthesia disables brain activity responsible for being conscious, yet other brain activity occurs while you are unconscious. So I'm going to use the phrase infrastructure of consciousness to mean the subconscious resources that provide the contents of consciousness, rather than the fact of being conscious. So I hope that makes some sense to you. So I'm calling everything you're not conscious of subconscious. And so you have subconscious resources that are busy making the content of consciousness and sort of delivering it to your consciousness. We'll get into that as I go on here. So I claim that the peripheral nervous system, like most of the brain itself, is part of this infrastructure of consciousness. And we'll be going through why I think that. Now, I'm neutral as to whether or not the peripheral nervous system has anything to do with the fact of being conscious. I don't really know what gets disabled with anesthesia, and I don't think anybody really knows. But as far as I can guess, it's just something to do with the brain that's being disabled and you're not conscious. Okay, so I'm going to lay out some of my underlying assumptions without discussing them or without trying to defend them. And some of these assumptions you probably won't like, but what I'm asking you to do is sort of pretend that you agree with me on these assumptions for purposes of getting through this talk. And then if there's things in the talk that you find of value, you might be able to repackage those things in terms of your own underlying assumptions. So first of all, from Penrose, I believe that consciousness simply is not algorithmic, is not computable. From Popper and Eccles, from many of their papers, but mostly their book, The Self and Its Brain, I believe that the mind is a non-material entity that interacts with the physical brain. And the self is not just a byproduct of brain activity, but an autonomous entity. I've added to this that the subconscious processes that are responsible for the content of consciousness are likewise not algorithmic. They're non-material and autonomous. So I believe that substantial improvements to our understanding of consciousness are possible. In other words, I'm not what they call a Mysterian that believes that this is going to be forever impossible for us to understand. But I believe that it will require some new physics, that it just can't be done with what we have so far. So let's just put all this in the background and start with the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is much more than just wires and relay stations. I think it's part of the infrastructure of consciousness. So what is it? Well, this is how it's typically presented. You have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And the main difference between it and the stuff outside the brain is the stuff outside the brain is not protected by the blood-brain barrier, but it's made of the same stuff. So I like to think of the peripheral nervous system as parts of your brain that are just not in your brain. They're just located in other places, but they're all deeply connected to the brain. So this way it's presented, there's an afferent division, which somatic sensory is from your body, all sorts of sensors that you have including the outside world, and from the viscera, from your organs. The difference here is that the axons in the somatic case are myelinated, and in the visceral case, they're not. Visceral case, the unmyelinated axons also make lots of non-synaptic connections as they're going up to the brain, so they're sort of like sampling or tasting the body on the way up. Now, coming down, the efferent division has a somatic nervous system, which has to do with voluntary movements, and an autonomic nervous system, which has to do with supposedly involuntary events. So this autonomic nervous system now has two parts, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic is the famous flight or fight reactions, and parasympathetic is the opposite, the so-called rest and digest functions. Now, this diagram, though correct, I think is highly misleading because it ignores the fact that everything is looped. Everything goes back to the brain. Everything down here is connected up here, as we'll see as we go on here. So ganglia, that's a gross anatomy term. They're brain-like structures outside the brain. So on this artist rendering of the outside of this guy's spine, on the one side of it, you see these bead-like things in yellow all connected together. These are the ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system. And it has a bunch of neurons in it and glia, and it uses the same neurotransmitters as the brain does. So again, I think I like to think of these things as little mini brains outside the brain. And the connection is usually given something like this. So this would be like a lateral slice. So from the spinal cord, there'll be a neuron synapsing with another neuron in this ganglion. There's also glial cells in here, and then the neuron goes to whatever the targeted innervated organ is, in this case, the heart. Now, what's misleading about this diagram is that it only shows one neuron, when in fact, there's a whole bunch of neurons. This is a cross-section through a single synaptic ganglia in a newborn mouse. So you can just imagine how tiny one ganglion is in a newborn mouse, and all of these purple dots are neurons. And this is a cross-section. It's not the entire volume. So even in the newborn mouse, one of these beads has a whole bunch of neurons in it. And you can also see that there's more than just a connection laterally from the spinal cord to it, but these things are connected going up and down. So here, when this eventually loads, is the whole autonomic system, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic, showing the innervation to all of these organs. And so these, if you can see my cursor, all of these little bumps here going all the way down and around and up the other side, these are all of the ganglia that we just talked about in the previous slide. And you can see there's a whole bunch of them. In addition, I know that it's very, very difficult, it's very small print, but you see the word ganglia here, ganglia there. These are all, again, like little mini brains. And then as we're going to see, inside the organs, there's little mini brains also inside these organs. So all of this is wired up in the sympathetic case. It's also wired up in the parasympathetic case. And again, all the things go both directions. So eventually, signals come from the brain to these organs, and then back from the organs back to the brain. So everything is doubly connected. Now, in addition to all of this wiring, there's a whole bloodstream mechanism for communication with the brain. So you have something called the endocrine system. Endocrine glands are glands that dump hormones into the bloodstream that then affect other things in your body, including your mood and things that have to do with what you are conscious of, the contents of your consciousnness. So there's something in your brain called the hypothalamus. It's a little tiny bit of brain. It's actually brain. But it innervates the pituitary gland, which then dumps different hormones into your bloodstream that go to different endocrine organs, which then dump hormones back to your brain. So there's a whole reciprocal system here that has nothing to do with neurons or nerves. It has to do with chemicals in your bloodstream. So here where it says A, the letter A, this is like the neurons from the hypothalamus innervating this neurosecretory cell, which then dumps a specific hormone into the general bloodstream, which then ends up going to whatever the target organs are. Now, I want to emphasize the two-way nature of all of this. So in this diagram, all of these little yellow cylinders are neurosecretory cell groups that are dumping hormones out. So you can see from the hypothalamus itself, it's dumping hormones into the pituitary, but mostly it's innervating the pituitary, which dumps out all these different kinds of hormones, which go to these endocrine glands. Now, when it gets to the endocrine gland itself is dumping hormones into the bloodstream, which is feeding back to the brain this way. Also, these hormones go to other things in addition to the endocrine glands. It isn't just the endocrine system that the pituitary influences, but all sorts of other things in your body as well. Now, you've probably all heard the term gut brain. I feel something, I have a gut feeling, or my gut tells me this, blah, blah, blah. You actually have something called the enteric nervous system that controls your digestive system. And it contains between 200 and 600 million neurons of 20 different types. And it's sometimes called the second brain or the brain in the gut. And this diagram shows these neurons here in the small intestine. So you have this, again, I view this as part of your brain that's not in your brain. Now, if you have a gut feeling, well, it could be because of the following reasons. Number one, the enteric system perhaps is not involved at all. The term gut feeling is just merely an expression that you use. Or it could be that the enteric system does have a role in producing this gut feeling. Now, there's two possibilities here. One is that it's an indirect role. In other words, the gut doesn't have any sensors of the outside. It doesn't have eyes and ears and things like that. So it gets signals from the brain. As we know, it's very well connected to the brain. And so the brain may essentially tell it something like, hey, I'm about to get on this airplane. And the gut may have a reaction like, I don't want to get on this airplane. And this reaction is transmitted back to the brain where it's interpreted as a conscious feeling, like a so-called gut feeling. That's one possibility. The other possibility is a direct role, that the signals from the brain induce a direct subconscious feeling from the enteric system itself. This feeling then doesn't necessarily go back to the brain, but it gets integrated subconsciously and delivered to consciousness. So we'll talk about more of these two possibilities in a moment. But first, I want to go to a more interesting thing is the so-called heart brain. So your heart has something called the intercardiac nervous system, ICNS. Sometimes this is also called its intrinsic nervous system, INS. So you'll run into both in the literature. It's an extensive network of neurons in the heart, utilizing neurotransmitters that are also found in the brain. The heart is responsible for producing and releasing multiple hormones. It synthesizes and releases oxytocin, which is implicated in various cognitive processes such as tolerance, trust, and social binding. In at least Western culture, the heart is also always associated with love and falling in love, and I have a heartfelt feeling and things like that. So we tend to use that independent of whether scientifically the heart is doing these things or not. But you can see that there's reason to suspect that it is related to these feelings, since it synthesizes and releases these hormones, which are then picked up by the brain. Now, the connection of the brain is much more than you might think. So the parasympathetic innervation of the heart is through the vagus nerve. And if you looked at inside the vagus nerve, 80% of the fibers are going back to the brain. The heart transmits more signals to the brain than it receives in return. And these signals just don't go to some place for like a knee-jerk reaction. The signals reach the cerebral cortex and they're directed to various brain regions, including the medulla, hypothalamus, thalamus, amygdala, as well as a pathway that directly projects to the frontal cortex. Supposedly, the frontal cortex is where you have your highest brain functions. And so, again, I like to think of the heart brain as part of your brain that's just not in your brain. It's in your heart where it's a good place for it because it has a lot to do with controlling your heart under different circumstances, but it's actually brain matter out there. Now, you have these same questions. If you have a feeling from the heart, a heartfelt feeling, you have these possibilities that it's just an expression or that the heart brain really is producing this feeling. And that it codes the feeling and it sends it back to the brain where it's interpreted consciously, or it induces a direct subconscious feeling itself. Then this feeling is integrated subconsciously and delivered to consciousness. So how can we distinguish these possibilities? Well, interestingly enough, people get heart transplants. Now, if you get a heart transplant, all of these nerve connections are severed and the surgeons can't possibly reconnect them. But the donor heart is attached by the blood vessels and the recipient's own nerves slowly grow and reinnervate over months and years. Now, what you get with the heart is not only the muscle, but you get this heart brain. So this comes with it. So in some ways, this is like a partial brain transplant. It's not in your brain. You're getting somebody else's brain, at least a little piece of it. And some heart transplant recipients experience new content in their consciousness, apparently due to their donor's heart. This is something that people like to not face up to because it causes people to not want to donate their hearts. I've seen people express that, well, wait a minute, if I die, I don't want part of me to still be alive in somebody else. Now, it is true that the heart transplant recipient will maybe get grouchy, have other changes in their personality due to these heavy-duty drugs that they're taking, because they take heavy-duty drugs to fight against rejection and things like that. So some changes in personality are due to the drugs. However, there are many studies in the literature where the recipient's behavior has mirrored something of the donors, and the recipients may exhibit preferences for food, music, sexuality, art, colors. All of these things, there's little anecdotal evidence of things that I won't have time to get into. But one example is that somebody received the heart of a young African-American person, and he developed a sudden love for classical music, the recipient, and he never liked classical music before. And it didn't make sense to him because where did this new feeling come from? And it couldn't have possibly come from this African-American boy who must rap or something. But it turns out the African-American boy was an expert classical musician and loved classical music. So again, you can believe these things or not, but if you look into them, there are lots of stories about this achieving some feeling that is more than just something trivial. Like I remembered somebody's phone number or something. It's an actual content of consciousness that is different than the content that you're used to. So I believe that heart transplant rules out possibility number one, that the heart feeling is merely an expression. I think we're down to these two options, and I've augmented them with what's in bold, that it's the indirect role, plus you have to admit that the heart brain has a degree of autonomy and can inject what I'll call feeling data on its own, because if you're thinking that the feeling has to come from the brain. Well, then somehow or other, the heart brain has to generate this feeling data, which gets transmitted back to the brain either one way or another, or this direct role, which is what I will be advocating as we go on here. Now, there are mechanisms for possible donor heart to recipient brain information transfer. There could be coded signals via the reinnervated autonomic nervous system, but there's people studying what's sometimes called cellular memory, bloodstream transfer via exosomes. So cardiac muscle cells secrete exosomes, which are packages of proteins, nucleotides, and receptors that travel throughout the body via the bloodstream, delivering their contents to other cells. They contain DNA and RNA, both are memory carriers possible, that might be conceivably transferred to recipient cells, as well as epigenetic transmission processes and prions. Prions are proteins that some people are implicate in memory functions. So if we look at this indirect role, I pose the question for you to think about, and that I've highlighted in yellow: can feelings be physically coded? I claim they can't be, but you say, well, wait a minute. Of course they can be. If I stub my toe, the pain goes up to my spine and into my brain, where I feel that my toe hurts. But the feeling was in the brain, not in the toe. I mean, you prove that because you can block the signal. If the signal doesn't get to your brain, if you go to the dentist and he injects you with Novocaine, he drills your teeth, you don't feel anything. So the feelings aren't where the action happens. The feelings are when the message got to your brain. Well, on the other hand, if the feeling actually occurred in the transplanted heart, the brain of the transplanted heart, if that's what generated the feeling, it would have to be coded somehow. And I can't imagine how you could do that. Even an expert novelist would have trouble expressing in words certain kind of feelings. I mean, if you imagine, let's say that you absolutely hate asparagus, the taste of asparagus, you just can't stand it. You'd never dream of eating it, but somebody else loves the asparagus. Well, how could that be coded into bits? Well, I'll leave it as an open question, but I feel that feelings can't be physically coded. So this slide is just to show that there's more than just the heart brain and the gut brain. This is the inferior hypergastric plexus. It does things that, there we go. And here's again a bunch of neurons in the inferior hypergastric plexus. I just wanted that in so that it isn't just the heart and the gut, but you have all these little mini brains throughout your body, and I think they all potentially affect the content of consciousness. So, to sum up, while being conscious requires certain brain activities that are disabled by anesthesia, the content of consciousness involves subconscious activity coming not only from the central nervous system, but also from the peripheral nervous system. Locally generated content from any part of the nervous system is directly experienced subconsciously, involving action taken by cellular subconscious. I probably should have said that. I think the first bullet is sort of established, and the other bullets I'm going to give you are my conjectures and nothing more. Now, the integration of this content that gets generated locally takes place subconsciously, because I don't think experiences themselves can be physically coded. And then delivery to consciousness performed subconsciously. I use the example, Hadamard wrote a great book called The Psychology of Invention in the Mathematical Field, where he describes dealing with the mathematical problem, looking at it from all angles, failing to be able to solve it, putting it aside, and then going about his business. And then when he was about to go on a streetcar, I think in Vienna, I'm not sure, when he grasped the handrail to get on the streetcar, the solution just hit him. In other words, it just was delivered to him. And there's lots of other examples in the arts and in science of people dealing with a problem consciously, putting it aside, and then having the solution just come to them either in a dream or whatever. So the next two slides summarize some relevant conjectures from some of my previous talks. I'll just go over this quickly. This is my idea of the evolutionary history of the infrastructure of consciousness. So the x-axis is a time axis in terms of billions of years ago. So the present moment is the far right, and 4.2 billion years ago is when the first life appeared on Earth. And the y-axis here is the status of the most developed living organism at that point in time. So this black with these bumps is what I call robotic mechanisms. In other words, things that are feedback control systems that are fully reducible to today's physical laws that a computer could emulate with no problem. And this robotic infrastructure has developed over all these billions of years, so it's much more than it was. So the first 2 billion years, there's nothing on the Earth except bacteria. I mean, there's nothing really going on. Then at some point in time, intermittent subconsciousness occurred, and it followed an evolutionary path of further enhancement and development. And finally, organisms occurred very recently, maybe 200 million years ago, that had some intermittent flashes of consciousness, and this developed into where we are today with humans. So these points I made earlier in previous presentations, that the autonomous subconsciousness evolved first, since the emergence of consciousness has always been between consciousness and the robotic functions of the body. So it has a life of its own, so to speak.
I'm done.
Could somebody mute their microphone so that I can finish talking? The subconscious originated as intermittent, non-conscious disruptions of the robotic mechanisms of single-cell organisms. The subconscious and consciousness both functions autonomously outside the computational realm. I use the analogy of the Boeing 737. When it first came out, several of them crashed, and they crashed because they had a defective flight control robot. And the ones that crashed were flown perfectly well earlier by pilots who turned off the flight control system. The flight control system tended to pull the nose down at takeoff, and pilots who fought it ended up losing the fight, and the plane crashed. Pilots who just turned the damn thing off flew it just fine. So the subconscious to robotic connection takes place inside cells, having evolved from single-cell organisms. And finally, it's an evolutionary outgrowth of this original single-cell discovery of processes that are partly physical, partly material, and partly non-material. Processes yet to be discovered, but are hinted at by various interpretations of quantum mechanics. So the next slides deal with my current focus of attention, and they're even more sketchy than the previous slides because that's the way it is. So quantum mechanics. Well, there are many interpretations of quantum mechanics and no consensus. Supposedly, none of this matters in conducting quantum lab experiments. I'm not so sure of that myself, but that's what everybody tells me. The standard Copenhagen interpretation is that the quantum state is an objective fact, but it collapses into a single outcome once an observer observes it. Collapse under this interpretation, and with the observer being a conscious person making the observation, is a process that is therefore partly material and partly non-material. So there are such processes, at least under this interpretation. The big problem here is that there are many, many different opinions about what is an observer. Is an observer limited to a person, a piece of classical equipment, the environment, and so forth? Attempt to deal with this muddle? Well, You can say there's no such thing as collapse, and you get the many worlds interpretation. You can say that something purely physical causes the collapse, such as gravity. This requires revising quantum mechanics because you have to add something to it that isn't there now. Or there's this radically different interpretation of what the calculus of quantum mechanics actually means. And this is QBism, which I will just very briefly go into. So QBism is a radically different interpretation, one that is perfectly compatible with the calculus of standard quantum mechanics. In other words, it doesn't require you to introduce something new like gravitational collapse, but it's based entirely on an interpretation of probability as being personal subjective assessment, not an objective fact. So if you take this into the limit, the quantum state and also various quantum processes are also subjective, and they're not objective. There's no third person perspective. There's no God's eye view of the universe. So a couple of quotes from Chris Fuchs. Anything in the agent's external world that may be considered a quantum system. So he means literally anything. The quantum measurement is not a passive observation of what is out there, but an action upon the world that aids it in releasing its potential. And quantum theory is no mirror image of the world, for there is no one way the world is. It is still in creation, still being hammered out. So each measurement that you're making constantly while you're out living and looking around at things is a measurement, and you're doing your little bit to hammer out the way the world is. However, it's not clear what this action on the world that the mind of the agent takes is. There's like 3 questions in this one sentence. Quantum QBism doesn't actually clear up the muddle, but I think it's a useful start. Now, I'm calling something Merminism. That this is a word I've just invented after David Mermin. He would probably hate me doing this, but Mermin has written some papers I'll talk about in a minute, and here's a quote from one of them. He says, "The QBist conversation can be broadened to include issues in which neither quantum mechanics nor probability plays a part, such as the problem of the now, which arises in purely classical pre-quantum physics." I would say instead is that Mermin is saying that the QBist way of thinking, this way of thinking with subjective probability, can be extended into the rest of science and into human life in general. And I think this is a very promising approach, which is sort of like stalled out because I call this kind of thinking Merminism in order to distance it from quantum mechanics. Unfortunately, Mermin is retired and no longer contributes to determine Merminism, and no one else does either, because the principal QBist scientists all have their hands full developing and defending QBism in a very hostile environment. So, as Mermin says, most physicists who have paid some attention to QBism have rejected this explicit introduction of subjective personal experience into science, together with its consequences for our understanding of quantum physics. It offends their sense of science that science is truly objective. Somebody please mute their microphone. Can you mute your microphone, please? For Christ's sake.
Brian Pitt, your microphone.
I'll just finish up with so Merminism, in my view, includes QBism as a subtopic limited to quantum mechanics. So here are these 4 papers. They're all on the archive. If you just search the archive for David Mermin, you can get these and read them. And I'll give you one last quote from Mermin about QBism. "QBists are often charged with solipsism, a belief that the world exists only in the mind of the single agent. This is wrong. Although I cannot enter your mind to experience your own private perceptions, you can affect my perceptions through language." And by language, he means more than just verbal language. He means anything we do to communicate with each other, including pushing each other around or something. So you can conclude that you are perceiving being like myself and for features of the experiences. This is how we arrive at a common understanding of our external world in spite of the privacy of our individual experiences. Part of the 90-year-old, now 100-year-old confusion at the foundation of quantum mechanics can be attributed to the unacknowledged ambiguity of the first-person plural pronouns and the carelessness with which they are almost used. For example, here's a sentence that measurements in QBism produce experiences in our privately constructed external world, not in our shared common world. And the word our is used two different ways in this sentence. So I have many remaining questions and problems in my fooling around here. One is this question we brought up earlier. What is this action that the agent's mind supposedly takes on the quantum world, resulting in an experience? Note that it's not a conscious action. Presumably it is a subconscious action. Might it be derived from the same subconscious to robotic disruption that began in single-cell eukaryote organisms that I conjectured earlier? Does conscious free choice and free will use the same probing action? Is there no such thing as passive experience? This bothers me a lot. Must the subconscious always do something to brain cells in order to get back a subconscious experience? This business of taking action on the world and getting a reaction, I wonder if I'm waking up and a big garbage truck goes by and shakes the house. That's something that just happened to me passively. I didn't do it. I wasn't asking the question, is there a garbage truck going by now? Is there a garbage truck going? And getting answers, no, 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 then yes. I wasn't doing anything. I was just laying there, and this experience happened to me. So I don't know how the not only QBism, but Stapp's interpretation and others, which require you to do something to the world first before you get an experience. I don't know quite how that works in terms of passive experiences. Finally, what are the conservation implications? I claim that there's conservation violation. We don't need to get into that now, but testing for conservation violation seems to be impossible with living organisms. I haven't figured out how anyone could do it. So here, just summarize everything here, and then I'll be done talking. While being conscious requires certain brain activities that are disabled by anesthesia, the content of consciousness involves subconscious activity coming not only from central nervous system, but also the peripheral nervous system. Locally generated content from the heart, brain, or any place or the part of the brain is directly experienced right there subconsciously. Integration of content takes place subconsciously. Experiences themselves cannot be physically coded. And delivery to consciousness is performed subconsciously, like Hadamard grasping the streetcar. So that concludes my talk.